So this is going to be a somewhat impromptu video. So please excuse any ramblings or ands, or any of the other things that I do that are annoying, and I don't realize how much I do them until I have to watch myself on video. But after the last video I made, I realized that it might be helpful if we break down what we mean when we use terms like capital D democracy. Because if you think about it, it doesn't have a good, useful definition. What I mean by that is that there is no down pat way that you can officially label any form of government a capital D democracy. Now, the debate bros and the college Republicans and everything else like that think that they have their formula, which I deconstructed in the previous video, where democracy is mob rule, or absolute democracy, as it is often called. Everybody votes on everything. And a republic is a refined, genteel system of laws and guarantees that ensures that you don't end up with mob rule. As I said, deconstructed that in my last video. We put that one to bed. But it does remain that these are ill-defined terms, at least in terms of the public discourse. So when a lot of people look at democracy, what they think it means is voting and elections and laws that ensure participation in the process, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And sure, the democracy oftentimes includes these things. But I think we're increasingly seeing that ensuring that process doesn't necessarily lead to a democratic outcome. And I think that when people talk about democracy more generally, what they're trying to achieve is a democratic outcome, an outcome that, at least roughly represents what people want in their lives. Now, we have an entire political party in this country that is devoted to believing that democracy is only a process. Of course, that's the Democrats. They're better than the Republicans, but, that's a very flawed way of looking at things. And it comes from the kind of post-Cold War consensus that reigned throughout the West, that taught and believed that if you had, not post-Cold War, post-World War II consensus, during the Cold War, that believed that if you had these strong, stable institutions, and that would automatically classify you as a government that is a democracy. What we have seen since the Cold War, and the actual post-Cold War period, is that governments that had these institutions were starting to de-democratize and move more towards oligarchy, even before the most recent rise of MAGA and Trumpism and the far right. Now, this was granted about 5 or 6 years ago, so this would have been during the first Trump term. But about 5 or 6 years ago, one of the Ivy Leagues, I don't remember which one, I'll post a thingy here, put out a study that concluded that the actual opinions of the people in the United States of America, the actual outcomes that they wanted, had next to no input on the laws that were put forward or the laws that were passed. So we have voting, we have elections, we have campaigns. Why are those campaigns so unrepresentative and the outcomes so unrepresentative of the will of the people? You know? And that gets us into the question of, okay, how is political power distributed in your system? Right? Because the power that individual bodies have within your governing system, and the power they exert over the system tells you a lot more about the reality of that system than what your laws say or what you say is the label that you go under, whether that be democracy or republic or constitutional monarchy or whatever. So, like, if you look at, what is a republic, technically speaking? Well, a republic is just a government that doesn't have a monarch. That is the actual literal definition of a republic, is just a government that doesn't have a monarchy. So the People's Republic of China is a republic. That is 100% true. However, a government like the Holy Roman Empire isn't a republic. But why? Because we've had republics that are called republics that were very similar to how the HRE worked. You have an elected head of state who has limitations that are put on their power, both constitutionally, in terms of what the written expectations are, but, like within the actual power dynamics of the country. The Holy Roman Empire was kind of internally, internally it was great at ensuring peace and prosperity amongst its members, but, in terms of acting as a unit, it was incredibly terrible. The Commonwealth of Poland-Lithuania was very similar to that, where, they had a kind of republican form of government, where you had elected heads and legislatures and what have you, but it didn't operate very well. But, rambling. But my point is that these governments, actually that's not a ramble, because, one of those is popularly called a Commonwealth. The other is the Empire. Both these governments ran very similarly. And the People's Republic of China is a republic. So why isn't the Holy Roman Empire a republic? Well, it's just because it had a guy who called himself the monarch, the Kaiser. So it's entirely for historical reasons that have nothing to do with any reality on the ground. So, these terms just aren't really very useful when you break it down. What is useful is to look at power distribution. And if you want a really great book on that, I always tell people there are 3 books that I recommend if you want to understand what is happening in the United States and more broadly what is happening in the West over the last 40 or 50 years. And one of those books is called The Dictator's Handbook. CGB Cray did a video long ago that was based on it. But for folks who aren't familiar, a lot of people are immediately put off by the title as soon as I say it. But The Dictator's Handbook is a book that was written by a professor who taught in the United States, but he was originally from Latin America. And when he got here, he noticed how woefully ignorant most Americans were of the concept and how oftentimes unwilling they were to think about the concept of political power and political power blocks and what influences those have over the outcomes in the system. A good government American who was taught well by our civics courses just thinks that, well, people go out and vote and then that represents the outcome. And that's never the way that any of this has worked in any society, anywhere in the world, at any point in history. Outcomes are determined by who holds the power within a country. And so he looks at a lot of different examples of dictatorships around the world and how they operated, and how they succeeded or how they failed. And he kind of bookends his book with two different examples from the United States. And his conclusion in that book, which was written in 2008, before the Obama presidency, before Trump, before the Affordable Care Act fights, before the Tea Party, before any of this stuff happened in the rise of American oligarchy right now. His conclusion was that the United States was becoming a dramatically less democratic society because ultra-wealthy influences and a certain educated elite who had a conservative tendency, whether they voted Democrat or Republican, they had a conservative tendency, were dominating American elections in the American political structure, while the structures and power blocks that had historically counterbalanced those currents, labor unions, civic organizations, just stuff like that, had significantly weakened in their power over the last 30 or 40 years. So U.S. elections were increasingly becoming dominated by both parties' desire to capture a smaller and smaller piece of the electoral block and power block and monetary block within the country. So, looking at that framework, the other two books, by the way, are Reagan Land and Nixon Land. They're Rick Perlman's series on, the rise of modern conservatism and the impact and where it comes from, the impact of that on the country. Very highly recommend those as well. I have referenced those books so many times, and I will continue to reference them in the future because they are amazing. Every single one of them is a frickin' doorstop, but they're great books. So, but anyway, getting back to the point. So, when we're talking about outcome, and what outcome is more democratic, as opposed to trying to use democracy as a term with an absolutist definition. But, in terms of where we want to talk about outcomes that are more democratic, we need to talk about power blocks and power distributions within a society. And, and that cuts across the board. If you don't have economic democratization, if you don't have an economic system that produces a more equal outcome, and of course, a bunch of people's butthole was just puckered right there because, oh my God, that's socialism. I mean, that's not even what I'm talking about. Just not having a massive underclass while a small, tiny portion of the country rakes in both money and power. Even just setting back the clock to 60 years ago, when you had an outcome where life was more manageable for a lot of people, at least in an economic perspective. And if you don't have that type of economic democratization and you don't have social democratization, then you cannot have a political democracy. You can call it that, but it ain't that. Because it's not producing a democratic outcome. And so when we talk about what is the goal of certain factions within the country, I mean, obviously the goal of the Republican Party is first to make the process less democratic by excluding groups that tend to not vote for the Republican Party. And then to just completely slash and burn the entire democracy as we're turning more things over to the rule of Elon Musk and Peter Thiel and people like that. The goal of the establishment wing of the Democratic Party right now is not really to preserve democratic outcomes so much as it is to kind of maintain at a rough level democratic institutions, but, you know, not give much voice to any type of wider, broader democratization that would get us set back on a course of where we were before I was born, basically. I mean, everyone always says Reagan. I always say that the old joke about Jimmy Carter being history's greatest monster is only half of a joke, because really a lot of this stuff started in the 1970s, and we only got Reagan because Carter acquiesced to a lot of it. But, you know, in terms of actually being able to get back to that level of social democratization, the mainstream of neither party right now, the power base of neither party, which isn't, not to say the voters, because, you know, the voters of both parties, broadly speaking, I want to remind you, because the upper middle class and wealthy, you know, those conservative factions of both parties that I mentioned before are very much getting what they want. But the rest of everybody is really just fighting over what they see as two bad options, and are mostly picking the side based off of cultural context and who is reaching out to them versus, you know, like what is actually going to lead to better outcomes for them. So I guess I can kind of stop there. Again, the point of this was to say that these terms don't really mean a whole lot just in general by themselves. And so if we want to talk about, you know, what the real meat of it is, we need to talk about democratic outcomes and the actions and policies and solutions that support that, as opposed to, you know, talking about either democracy as this thing that's encased in marble, or, you know, no, we don't want that, we're a republic, which is also just a completely meaningless term and usually just means oligarchy. More oligarchy always, forever. That's what the real meat of that argument oftentimes is. So, yep, getting past that now. I have another video coming out here soon. It sort of continues along this track, but looks at a different issue. So look out for that. And when I say soon, I mean soon. This is not going to be a situation like it was in the past. These videos are going to be a little dirtier. They're going to be a little more focused and less in the weeds than my past videos oftentimes were. But I am actually going to produce them. So that is my pledge. So when I say another one's coming out very soon, I actually mean soon. So, but in the meantime, take care, everybody. Have a good day.